Susan and Eric and to everyone else who worked behind the scenes to make this happen. I don't want to take too much more time, so hopefully we can get straight into it. One of the places I wanted to start was in thinking about my course on hip hop that I teach. So many of the students come into my class really wanting to know about the politics of hip hop, right? That's really the reason why they take the class is they want to know, how did this political social movement start and where can it go? And one of the things I do at the very beginning of the class is I ask them to question that assumption and look back to the roots of hip hop in the early 70s and understand that, yes, it was political, but it was also at a very basic level, it was about play and having fun and experimentation and just taking pleasure in dance and music and eventually poetry, right? The rap itself. So what I really wanted to ask the artists is to help us think about that relationship between play and politics, right? Is hip hop sort of political by definition? Like, is every time we hear a hip hop song, we're engaged in some kind of political action? Or is it more of a case where some of it is really about play and pleasure and some of it is really about politics, and they may meet, but not always? Mariah, would you mind starting us off with this question about the relationship between play and politics when it comes to hip hop?
Sure. I do want to push back slightly on the premise of the question, in that I do think the roots of hip hop are inherently political to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Though people were, just having a good time, the community organizing it took to put together something like a block party, in a certain sense, was also taking the place of community formations and mass mobilizations akin to the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement, which were seeding in the early era of hip hop. And so with people reclaiming the streets, when they are abandoned by their government, to come together to support one another, to come together to share their own narratives about what their worlds were like, rather than having narratives imposed by the outside, I would say is inherently political. But I think a pleasure is inherently political for Black people as well. Living in a white supremacist society where, we are subject to a multitude of forms of subjugation all around, to assert oneself in public space, from a place of joy, is also an act of resistance. And so I would say that's the key linkage between politics and play that we see in hip hop, that regardless of whether or not you're coming with a socially conscious message, if you are using it as a tool for mass political education, whether or not you were the CNN journalist of Compton telling people what's happening out here on the block, even if you are simply having a good time, that is a way to push back on white supremacy. And so that, I think, is inherent to hip hop of all colors and flavors, from Killer Mike to 21 Savage.
Great. I really appreciate that, and the way you reframed the question. One of the things you did in the course of your answer was talk about the content and lyrical content. And I think a lot of the times that's where our mind goes when we think about politics. What are the folks actually saying on the record or in the performance? But Rennie, this is where I want to bring you in, because in dance, we're using different tools as medium of communication and expression, right? We're using our bodies, right, to really deliver a message or to make people feel a certain way, to affect the crowd. So when you think about the politics of hip hop dance, how does it fit into some of this other discussion about hip hop politics, which is usually dominated by the MC and rap music? How do you feel like your world fits into this story? I think you may be muted.
Well, actually, I see it the opposite way. I feel like the dancers dominated. You know what I mean? Because movement is the last manifestation of your reality. So movement, that's us. We confirm reality. Our expression is based on what's happening politically, economically, and socially in the world, right? And so what we do is a reflection of that. I wanted to second, or just kind of jump on Mariah's point that hip hop is political, was political from gate, right? The idea of play suggests that we are following a Western construct in regards to African Americans, meaning we're always playful, we're like childlike. So this is not about play. However, one thing to think about is Afrika Bambaataa. He takes on the name African Bambaataa after he comes back from Africa, where he meets some Zulus. The name Bambaataa is the chief's name who resisted the British, the Zulu chief.
Yep.
So he comes back, changes his name to African Bambaataa, and creates the longest running hip hop organization in its history, right? The Zulu Nation, right? That alone is a political statement. Mm-hmm. It begins that way with him, right? Formally. Prior to that, right, we have the gang culture, who of course was resisting the government and authorities, right? Remember, the gangs were also being recruited into Black Panthers, young lords, like all the different revolutionary groups as well. And so their mentality is really the beginning of hip hop culture, because they're the ones who my generation is the generation under the ones who created it, right? Saw doing the dance called the outlaw, mm-hmm. Right? The outlaw is what? Resist authority, resist, right? The whole platform itself is political. The name hip hop, according to Dr. Geneva Smitherman, comes from the word hippie, which is spoken in the language of Wolof. And it means to be aware or to open your eyes or reopen your eyes. The fifth element of hip hop is knowledge. In my opinion, there's nothing playful about it. You know what I mean? I have friends who've died who've been murdered. I've been shot. You understand? having, I think, confusing, let's put it this way, Pop Master Fable said to me that there's a difference between urban culture, youth culture, and hip hop culture. Right?
No question. No.
Yeah. So in any case, we are the manifestation of all of that stuff that came before us. So when you see cats rocking or whatever they're doing, mm-hmm. It's a resistance. When people are dancing, most of the time they're dancing so hard, going hard on pavement. It's a resistance, right? We are the last manifestation of reality movement.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think the history that you're giving, however brief here, is really important. And to trace that lineage and understand where the collective act of hip hop came from is really vital to this conversation. Samir and Asia, I was hoping I could bring you two in here because I'm curious, given what we just heard about the ways politics is really baked into the performance of hip hop, right? And the pleasure of hip hop, how it is that you as performers, right, came into this thing, right? In other words, did you come in with that mindset that part of what I'm doing as a creative person, as an artist, is I'm resisting? Or did you come in as, so many folk who go into creative endeavors, there's just something in them and they just follow what's in and let it out. And in other words, it's a less kind of conscious process. Where does politics come into your work as an artist? Is it something that's front and center in everything you do, or is it just a natural outgrowth of the kind of impetus, like the urge to create something?
So I'm originally from Hollis, Queens. My mom used to help Russell Simmons hand out flyers, run DMCs around the neighborhood. Curtis Blow was dating my aunt at one point. So in terms of the culture and my involvement in it, it's always been my life. I don't see myself apart from it, probably the same as Rennie and Mariah and Sacramento Knox and Samir. One thing that I'd like to say is hip hop is called the joyful rebellion for a reason. And we have to remember that hip hop was a cultural response to prejudiced socioeconomic policies that put drugs into communities, that eliminated education in the arts programs from schools, that it diminished and eliminated affordable housing, that there was a job shortage. It was a cultural response to political policies that were enacted upon our communities. And so hip hop is inherently political because everything we do, even if Rennie's dancing in the middle of a street, it's a physical, realistic response to some type of oppressive situation that's being impressed upon the community. And I think it's incredibly important that going forward in this situation, we remember that the birth of hip hop is a cultural response to oppression and prejudice at the highest levels of politics in America. You know, so hip hop is perpetually young, and we're all elevated in a youth spirit when we're connected to it, because it reminds us of our capacity to rebel against things that are oppressive. Anytime we show up to do any music, our consciousness is elevation, our consciousness is connection, our consciousness is vocalization. And sometimes in our position, our job is to make ourselves invisible to create visibility. So when it comes to the youth, when it comes to different elements of hip hop, we could not say that we're not political artists, because the art form that we're practicing, that we're embodying, that we're living is our cultural response to political decisions. I think the hypersexualization of Black people is a part of hip hop. I think you'll see a lot of the ills of society reflected in how these youth are expressing themselves. We have children griots in hip hop culture. We have children that stand in front of crowds and tell their stories, give their testaments and their testimonies, because it's so community based. And in hip hop, if you don't have a space for the children and a space for the elders, then not everything in the society is being represented. So a lot of people try to alienate people who might have a socially conscious message or might have a political message from the people that are just talking about having fun. But the entire context of the music is letting Black people have a say in how our stories are told, letting brown people have a say in how our stories are told, and letting marginalized and diminished people have a say in how their stories are told.
Great. Thank you. Samir, do you want to jump in as well?
Yeah. Sorry, we're married, so sometimes I just
don't want to. No, but as far as our introduction to the whole thing, coming from the kind of neighborhoods that we came from, I was born in Brussels, Belgium, and watching the older guys in the neighborhood dancing, these were hardcore gang members who turned that into dancing and battling one another. That's what I used to try to do, right? So till this day in our performance, we incorporate that dance element as well. But also from the late 80s to the late 90s, that's when I was introduced to hip hop, and the kind of hip hop that was on the radio and that had singles out at the time. Those weren't political artists, but they had a political message. For example, like Queen Latifah, Public Enemy. These were records that you were playing in a club, but that also had a strong message in it. So I just always embodied that and created music in that same vein.
Yeah, and we also think that a lot of times when there's conversation about hip hop, it elevates one type of music over the other. But I think the fact that we're Black and brown people, it's not so much about value alignment when your survival is your primary thing, when you're trying to survive, when you're trying to live. And so we're able to all stand under this umbrella together, regardless of, the different aspects of our lives. Every single one of us has somebody that we know or are related to that represents some aspect of the music that's being delivered to people at this point. And I just think our opinion when it comes to politics and social conscious message is also to find ways to navigate and embrace the youth in their expression as well, and not ostracize them or put them at an arm's length, because we're all battling for our lives at this point. We're battling against systems that take our lives from us. And, when we are all facing the same obstacle, our values become less important in their alignment, and just our togetherness and our will to survive becomes one of the most important things.
Okay. Thank you for that. Knox, I want to bring you in here because one of the things that strikes me in the contributions we've heard from our panelists so far are, the different ways that the elements of hip hop need to be combined to really understand what it is, right? Can you understand what hip hop is if you leave out knowledge as the fifth element? Can you understand what hip hop is if you don't understand the role that dance has played from the very beginning? And in some of your work, it seems to me that you're mixing a whole bunch of different media together. Yes, you're making beats, but you're drawing on so many different sources and forms of communication for your inspiration and for your art. So can you talk a little bit about that mixture and your sense of yourself as an artist, as someone who performs fusion, right? And brings different elements together, different musical traditions together, and why you think that's so essential and elemental to what hip hop has been and what it still is today.
Yeah, I think it grows as it goes. So the stuff I'm making now is just kind of a culmination of grind, not grinding like the, hustling things, but like the grind of work and things that are kind of coming together. And it's always when doing the work, it was like to do, like some gang prevention work, instead of like learning how to move sticks and chop bricks, it's like microphones and raps and do after school stuff, do just, what I'm saying, just other things, opportunity to do other things. So it was always in that mode. So blending those things is, there's different cultures in there. I'm from Southwest, so there's like an immigrant community here. It's also the largest Black community on Turtle Island, which people refer to the United States of America. So I'm an Anishinaabe person in Detroit. So like all these things kind of collide together. We also have the largest Arab community on Turtle Island as well. So you have all these powerful people here, and these things kind of blend as things move. And for me, it's like kind of sharing some of those realms of things, like indigenous music or sounds and ideologies and bunch of things that are very. I mean, it's about community and the circle, So it's just how it looks at the moment right now, and it's how it feels at this moment, I'm sure in another 300 or 1,000 years, it's gonna look and feel different as well, It's gonna still kind of be the same thing.
I think that sense of time and that sense of moment is especially important in the moment that we find ourselves in. The pandemic is ongoing, and as our panelists have described, right, state violence and illness borne by the state and imposed upon brown and Black communities is not new, right? So this is not the only pandemic that brown and Black folk have faced in the history of certainly the United States and colonialization more broadly. But I'm wondering, Rennie, what you've seen as we've moved through the past year of our history in this country, the ways that hip hop communities and Black arts communities have responded to the working, living, and dying and mourning conditions of the pandemic. Again, with full knowledge that this is not new for so many of the communities that we belong to, but how have you seen the response at this moment compare maybe with other eras? Have new forms, new possibilities emerged? Has the collaboration between Black artists in hip hop and elsewhere grown in ways that maybe we haven't before? Is there something unique about this pandemic that hip hop and your experience can speak to?
That's a good question. I don't know, for me personally, I don't know how unique it is, right? So, everything that's happening, the state of Black folk in America, globally as well. We've always been, in my opinion, we've always been in this sort of state of being. The phrase "body in crisis," like our physical bodies are always in crisis, right? Mode. Like I was talking to a friend the other day about how we Black folk, when we're driving, we were laughing about it actually. We're driving, and as soon as we see a cop, it's like, oh, we have this sort of physical, visceral reaction, looking back in the mirror to see if they're going to come after us, right? And so this idea that we're always in crisis, I don't think is, anything. I mean, it's a sad thing. However, I don't know if it's unique, right? I will say what is great to see is the younger folk, right? Like, the young cats getting in there and getting out there and motivating me. You know what I mean? Because when I look at it, I'm like, yeah, you know what, man? I'm gonna be real with you for a second. My thing is, if y'all ready to do it, let's do it. Let's go. When we were at the Million Man March, had that man said, let's go, the White House would have been done. My generation is just a little different. You know what I mean? And so I feel like I was proud to see folk in the street, young folk, Casper dancing in protest, Casper was rhyming in protest, people were playing music in protest, right? And it was interesting to watch people not get it, not understand. But we've been doing this since the cakewalk. The whole point behind the cakewalk, we were mocking the masters, right? We were finding power in that action. And we're still doing the same, you know what I mean? We're still at it. We're like in this loop. So, you know, I don't know how unique it is. I just had a checkup today. Still afraid of the doctor, still afraid. I go now, I'm like, I gotta go, right? It's to me a fear that's in us, in the Black folk, about them putting things in us, from Tuskegee to all this other, on the border with the young women, giving young women hysterectomies. This is recent, right? Like random shit. Like, so we're supposed to just trust that system. You got me. So to me, I don't know, and maybe one of my younger colleagues can speak to that, but I don't see how different or how unique it is, other than technology. And
Yeah.
we seem to flourish in that, but you know, we have no progression in our emotional development as humans on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you opened the door there to a couple of different things. I appreciate your answer, and again, giving us a sense of how multiple generations have played a part in getting us to where we are now. And yet you opened the door to think about what role technology and the spread of both misinformation and facts, right, has played in this pandemic moment that we find ourselves in. Mariah, I know that, you know, before the event began, we were sort of talking about the local politics in Georgia and the situation you find yourself in, right? So you're very intimately involved at the ground level in the kind of ongoing social movements for decency, justice, and respect for working people, Black and brown people in this country. For you and your peers, has there been something about this pandemic moment that is connected to your hip hop identity and your hip hop life? What would you kind of muse about when it comes to this question of hip hop during the pandemic?
Well, something that I found very interesting about the pandemic, and particularly the ways, if you want to call them non-hip hop communities, have started to simulate or emulate practices within the hip hop community. I think people getting grassroots political education around things like mutual aid that have been very common within, you know, Black communities with regards to just networks of care that we have had to rely on in times when we couldn't rely on the government. That those kinds of practices are becoming a lot more widespread, and that people are coming to understand their political and their revolutionary potential has been very interesting during this time. But I think as well to think about the ways that to kind of piggyback off of some of what Rennie was saying, for hip hop artists who had to fight to be seen, to fight in a predominantly white town like Athens, Georgia, to be platformed and to take space in our city, in our cultural milieu as a city, the ways that the digital tools that are native to us as, you know, millennials and Gen Z, the way that we've leaned into those new communities in order to continue to share our stories, continue to be connected in community, I think is something that we all can also learn from, whether you are a hip hop artist or not. The way that people are using TikTok or Twitter or Instagram to not only promote their art, but to do mass popular political education through hip hop, or through just like sharing photos of themselves out, making sure everybody on the block got water and something to eat and a mask on, making sure that people are aware of, you know, we got tear gas last Tuesday, and like this is the proof. So I think that this post hip hop generation, the folks that like may not have come up of the second wave of folks for whom we don't remember a world without hip hop. You know, hip hop has always existed to us. The ways that we may lack some of that that rootedness in the nascent traditions, the traditions that like first gave spark to the movement we now know as hip hop. We may lack that grounding, but we have a very diverse suite of new tools to see that its values are proliferated, our stories are continually told, and that we are strengthening our communities, even if we physically cannot be together because of the pandemic right now.
Asia and Samir, I see your heads nodding. I'm going to bring you in just a minute, but I want to go to Knox real quick because as the panelists were talking, Knox, the image that I have of your studio is actually reminding me a little bit of the versus battles that we've seen on Instagram, where you have artists, you know, competing with each other and trying to play their greatest hits, going back and forth. And that strikes me as, you know, and the dance parties, right, that we've seen by various hip hop DJ personalities and on Instagram. That strikes me as another way that music is playing a role in this movement in a digital space, right? Where we're going to places like Instagram and other digital spaces and forming communities, allowing music to sustain us and heal us, right? Because there's a recuperative and a healing function that the music can also serve, in addition to providing the motivation for being out in the street and interrupting and affirming. So can you talk a little bit about that dimension of musical practice, music as something that can help us heal, music as something that can provide connection? Because I think when we talk about the politics of hip hop and the care that the music provides, we can lose that sometimes in thinking about the ways that the music can help us disrupt and organize. So something in a slightly different bucket, the kind of restorative, the healing function of music at a time like this. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, like what I'm hearing, what I'm reflecting on what you're saying is kind of like looking at music as utility, or in this time as utility. I always thought of as that because I come from like community organizing or using it that way, or like just being in the park. Before like just take different routes with it, like work with it business wise or professionally, like as it sits in the streets and things. So I always think of it as utility. So even when I'm like cutting a new vinyl, like like it comes with a language revitalization, so I can transfer the lyrics or translate the lyrics into the native language, and it can go to certain tribes or nations to have another tool to help to use some language revitalization with stories. So that's like one ways of thinking about utility and resistant, or like going from like resistance to restore or rejuvenate, from the next steps and making things beautiful, beauty out of disaster. So definitely I'm hearing you is definitely these making music is a tool and utility, I'm sorry, in certain instances, whether it was doing gang prevention work or just doing community arts, like just having access to technology. We organized for J Dilla Day, and we just pulled all our beat machines out, and then the young folks came up and just learned. We just made beats. So, like learning all that stuff, and so it always happens, and I don't know, it's beautiful. Detroit got some things over here, so it's always nice and beautiful, and I can go on about that, but definitely like in Detroit, it's a cultural organizing tool we use. Like it's definitely a part of our well-being and our resistance and our growth out here in Detroit.
That's beautifully put. I really appreciate that framing of music as a utility. This is my chance to get you back in, Samir and Asia, because I saw you giving some, positive signals, some positive signaling. There's some agreement, digital agreement through the screen with what some of our other panelists were saying.
First of all, to the fellow panelists, come on, y'all up here giving the word.
Yeah.
We over here just smiling and just happy and feeling the mercy of being with your companions. You know what I mean? Being with people, that are from your community, that embrace one another and encourage one another and inspire one another. So I just want to say that to begin, but I'll let Samir.
And it's something, that same sentiment is something that comes when we get in these gatherings where we may not know one another personally, but we've had we have similar experiences, right? So when I hear Ronnie speaking, we're, like he was saying, this is nothing new to us, right? We're familiar with marching. We're familiar with protest music because these are things that have been going on. A lot of these topics that have been going on, but the special thing about it is not necessarily for us, but it's for the younger generation who were stuck at home during the pandemic and had no choice but to face these realities by seeing it on TV and never experienced a march before. So then you have artists like Lil Baby creating songs, protest songs, out of all people, right? Somebody that we may not necessarily listen to, but is making great points, and my son who's 10 years old is singing along to that.
Right. We're all from the same village, and this is what's normal in our village. Like, this is what we teach our children to do. This is how we teach our children to show up. You know, and one point that I wanted to make is there's a book, when you're talking about versus battles, there's an anthropological and sociological study that was gathered into a book. It's called Black and White Styles of Conflict. Right. And it talks about, for example, in a classroom, if two Black students are in each other's face going like this and doing the stuff, you know, we do to a white teacher, that constitutes a fight. Right. But the Black students would say we weren't even fighting. You know what I mean? Nobody was fighting. Like, there was no punches thrown. Like, this book has really shown me the lenses through which our cultural differences are very apparent. Right. And so in African culture and in indigenous culture in general, there used to be wrestling competitions. We consistently competed with each other with the intention of inspiring people. It was a test of will and of strength and of courage. And it was so that if you were not the best, you learned to be better. It was only with the perversion of the industry that it became the best person lives and the worst person dies. You know what I mean? That wasn't natural for us culturally. It was like, if I'm better than you, you're going to spend all year to be better than me next year. And as we aged out of that, our children became better than us. And that was the intention. That was the goal. You know, and I think in the hip hop community, we still feel the same. Second thing I wanted to talk about, the question that you asked Mariah, when you talk about the pandemic, like, hip hop is a practice of alchemy. It's like poetry, it's alchemy with words, right? And creating metaphorical concepts to communicate your internal condition through your external reality. So when the pandemic happened, what's a pandemic to an epidemic, right? Like, we've consistently had diseases metaphorically put into our communities for years and years and years and years, and we begged for inoculations. But now we recognize that our community is our immunity. You know what I mean? And once we became cognizant of that, you know, our communities have had pandemics of poverty and of an influx of drugs. Like we've talked about, we've dealt with epidemics, consistently. So now that the world is affected by something, that it's affecting every single person, we're like, we've been in this, we've been isolated, we've been cast out, we've been having our voices diminished, we've been having any of our gatherings broken up. Like, we've had these experiences for a lot of time. You know, and I think in talking about us being from the same village, we're all parts of the same body. The dancers are the physical body. The MCs are the voice. The graffiti artists are the arms and the hands. The DJs are the ears. And we're of many minds, you know, which is why knowledge is important in hip hop. We're a community and a village of one body and many minds.
That's beautifully put. I want to save some time for Q&A. Before we do that, though, can I pick up on one thing you just said and that some of our other panels referred to at least a little bit? You talked about the role of industry and the way that it has perverted, distorted some of the cultural values and practices that were indigenous to hip hop communities and turn them into something that they're not, so they can be packaged and sold to audiences, of course, that are outside of the original spaces of production. And yet, we also just heard a little bit about, you talked about Lil Baby and his performance and other commercially successful rappers who have certainly tapped into the news, the moment we find ourselves in, and made music and crafted performances that amplify, call attention to, or do something with what's going on in the street. So I guess the question I want to ask is, with all that we know about the dangers of the music business, right, and the long history of exploitation of Black creators' labor, is there any role for industry to play in this moment or in this process of resistance? Because we know, again, we know how damaging and exploitative it's been. And yet we can point to artists who have made interventions and called attention to things that maybe under different conditions, the broader public wouldn't have heard of. Is there any value in that? Or is it just really, whenever you let massive corporations get their hands on something, the costs are always higher than the benefits? Since you introduced the idea, Asia and Samir, do you have any thoughts on this? If there's what role industry can play at all right now?
I think that it's interesting to talk about that because we've been navigating that for the duration of our career. But when I watched how panicked labels got about the introduction of social media and artists being able to reach out to people without the label's influence, without the label's decision making, they panicked. Like they completely freaked out. Freaked out at streaming services. They freaked out at anything that created like a free access Smithsonian museum of content they felt like they should own. You know, and artists started freely exchanging ideas and freely exchanging music, and that caused great concern to them because it used to be to reuse the context and the metaphor of wrestling, that we wrestle and the kids would wrestle each other and we'd say this person's better and the person who lost would be able to go spend time getting better. What the industry does is they say this person's better, so we're going to kill this person. Right? And it gives the person no lifeline to improvement, no lifeline. And a lot of people in the industry feel like their heads get cut off. You know what I mean? Because when they're in the ring, they're the person who is the most demonstrative or is peacocking the most is the person who wins without what maybe somebody might feel like is an exercise of skill. I think the difficulty with the industry is what's rewarded, and how when we were on tour with Miss Lauryn Hill, she told me something incredible, and it's the more that they try to isolate you from what you know to be true, from the people who know who you are, the more concerned that you need to be, because it could not just be a physical separation, but a separation from ideals. You know, and when we have exposure and things like that, it's cool to have a label give you access to more people, because that's the goal, right? With the music, is you want it to reach as many people as possible. I think that it's an abusive relationship between the industry and artists, and I feel like we're not really sure how to navigate the abuses that occur in that relationship, so we try to find ways around them.
Yeah, Rennie, thank you so much for that. Rennie, I saw your head nodding as our colleagues and comrades were talking just now. Did you want to reflect a little bit on this question of industry? You may be muted.
And there you have it. I had two thoughts. One was that it's not the industry. Industry is white folk, is Western thinking. It's the idea of believing a particular ideal, and then that they have to, this particular grouping or folk have to control everything. And so industry is, of course, one of the arms. However, it's broader. You got me. So that was my thought when Asia said that, and I thought that was beast. And I think it's a bigger fight, or bigger, energy or thinking process we have to sort of like navigate. The other part that I thought that Asia explained very, it was just, you were explaining the cipher. You know what I mean? The cipher is 360 degrees complete knowledge, right? We, street dancers, from MCs to whomever in hip hop culture, that is what we worship, the cipher, right? Because the cipher pushes you to the next level. As a dancer, I go in, I'm like, I'm popping, I'm doing my thing, just killing it, right? Another cat comes out and like, right? And I'm like, and I get like, oh, really? Let me show you this. So that person is going to push me to my next level. There was no such thing, you know what I mean, as, in my opinion, it wasn't competition.
Nah, the circle protects you. That's why.
Right. It's there to protect you. See all your enemies, right? And you have so for instance, we kids, we would battle. We go in, we do our thing. And we go back to our neighborhood. Yeah, we killed it. The other cats went back to their neighborhood. Yeah, we killed it. You know what I mean? Like nobody, it was no sense of full on real, like we're competing until like the dance contest. And now with this madness, the last 10 years of America's Best Dance Crew and all this other madness, right? And so this idea of competition, you know what I mean, is being instilled and has been instilled in our consciousness, yeah? In the circle, there's no beginning, there's no ending. It's a collective. And when you stand in the center, guess what? You're getting loved. All that energy is right to you. And guess what? When you're standing in the circle, in the cipher, it's the collective consciousness, right? And then guess what? You get a chance to be inside to get that love again, right? That's what's so beautiful about that idea. But when you have linear thinking, which I'm calling Western thinking, right? This 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Off bat, you know who's first. Off bat, you know who's one, who's mediocre in the middle, almost number one, that kind of thing. In the cipher, no. In the cipher, no.
No,
and so these are things I was thinking about when Asia was talking. I was like,
Brittany, if I could just say, like, when you said that inspired me so much with the Western thinking, because the illusion of scarcity is dangerous for us. Right? Because generally when the master is in the circle and the person that he's trained for his entire life finally beats him, the master smiles, right? Because the fullness of the knowledge has been transferred, right? But when there's an illusion of scarcity, the master cannot let go, right? He has to kill the child, right? In order for him to maintain his position. But in the traditions that anthropologically we come from, when the youth you've trained their entire life in a skill is able to best you, it brings you joy, right? Because you're like, that's what I'm talking about.
You know, it's funny, you mentioned Pop Master Fable. One of our first time in the Bronx, we were at this gathering, and there was a couple young guys kind of dancing it, and Fable was just kind of doing, you know, basic top rock. But once he saw that the kids were really getting down,
a kid tried to battle him.
He took his vest off.
He said,
he's like, okay, let's get it
with the wrong one.
Because and you know why? Because the idea, if a young cat come at you, take him out, no matter how. If he just started yesterday, he needs to catch wreck, so he can always remember the lesson that he learned that day.
But then a lot of times Fable starts mentoring these same kids who try to battle him. He say, you want to be better than me? I will teach you how to be better than me. And that's the important thing in our culture that people don't always recognize. Battle culture is not about who bests who. It's about how are you representing in this space and how can you more fully represent? You know what I mean?
And I'm sorry.
With the black and white styles of conflict, you see battle raps, people are like, oh, these things are so horrible, these things are so negative, but it's a test of wit. Sorry, Michael.
But let me also say too, this comes from this idea of scarcity, right? This battle mentality comes from the gang culture, which was coming from this idea of scarcity, yeah? And so this is where we get the term battle, because the dancers in the gangs, because these were dancers who were doing the war dance. That's why it was called the outlaw dance. They were going to war with another gang. And our generation took that idea and put that into our, in honor of them. Now, our generation, the difference is the dance often caused the fight. All right, so I'll stop there because there's more to that. But
go ahead, Michael. Sorry, we was vibing. We was building.
I know, and there's so much more we could say on this topic. Susan and Eric, I'm gonna steal an extra 10 minutes on the back end here and hopefully go to 9:10, because 9:10 Eastern, which is 7:10 your time. What I'd like to do as I bring Knox and Mariah into this piece of the conversation is I'd like the folks who are listening, if you have questions, to answer them in the chat, to enter them in the chat. And I'll do my best to pick out one or two things. And then toward the end, Samir and Asia, I'm going to ask you to kind of take us out with a little music rather than doing it now. So I want to continue the conversation for 2 more minutes. Then I'm going to go to whatever questions pop up in the chat. We'll do those for 6-8 minutes, and then you two will take us out, if that's okay. Does that sound right? Great. Mariah, we just had a really fruitful exchange, and the initiation for that exchange was the provocation was my question about industry. So, I think one of the things that this makes me think of is the commodification and the corporate reproduction of activism, right? Like we can talk about it when it comes to Black Lives Matter, and every organization has a Black Lives Matter Day, or you can talk about one of the examples we teach all the time, Pride, right? Queer liberation movements and the ways that those social movements are appropriated for other purposes. So I'm just wondering, again, in some of your recent work, if you've seen some of these ideas become mainstream, get cut out and pasted into contexts that aren't helpful, but maybe does raise a level of exposure for, thinking about the NBA, for example. I mean, people who watch the NBA, the National Basketball Association, right, and you see the words Black Lives Matter on a court, even if they don't want to, when their kids ask them, they now have to say something about it. Now, we understand that the incorporation of Black Lives Matter into the NBA serves an end goal that's about profit. But is there still some value when we see that kind of cutting and pasting, that lifting of slogans into commercial products, whether we're talking about rap music or other Black cultural spaces? What do you think about that?
I hope I don't disappoint anybody with my answer, but my answer is no. What concerns me, and what I think I was hearing echoes of in some of y'all's comments before, and really wanted to weigh in on around the question of industry, is that folks within our genre and our field are very adept at diagnosing social ills because we have lived them. We understand the failures of bad public policy, but divorced of political analysis, of theory, or divorced of community organizing history and contemporarily what is happening in our neighborhoods, it's hard for folks to use. What we're seeing right now is a difficulty for folks to know what is the best use of their platform. Because it isn't tied to like a consistent theory of change that is informed by the movements for Black liberation of old, or revolutionary politic of days gone by. And so I do think there is potential there. Whether or not we are seeing it manifest currently, it does trouble me, but I don't want to give up hope. I don't want to be a nihilist and say like, well, commodification and commercialization of our genre has made it such that we can't break through and attain like a liberatory stance that we then transmit messages of change. Not just that things need to change. We're very aware of that, and like the NBA has brought great awareness to that. Lil Baby has brought great awareness to that. But what do the changes need to be? Informed by abolitionist thinkers, by a theory of change driven by the movers and shakers of civil rights and slavery abolitionists before us. How do they get things done, and what was their vision of what needed to change, and how do we carry that work forward? And so I think that these displays of solidarity with the movement, particularly by artists, I don't trust capital. So like when Coca-Cola issues their little tweet about how Black Lives Matter, like miss me with that. Like if Black Lives Matter to you, why would you give money to Republicans that are currently pushing voter suppression bills through that state legislature? Thank you. But when individuals, when artists take their platform and use that to highlight ways we can come together to make change. I do believe that the dialogue we are having around how they're using those platforms, when people like what happened at the Grammys, like get a little bit of pushback for the glorification and fetishization of Black death, like maybe not a good look to have like Rayshard Brooks' death kind of on display for y'all's entertainment, but the conversation we then get to have around that moment could be a catalyst for us to push farther into truly liberatory politics in the music and through the platforms that people do have. So I have hope. I have hope for the artists. I do not have hope for Capital. Shed a
Good.
tear. They ain't never gonna be on our side. You know, BMI, ASCAP, Sony, Universal, whoever, they ain't never gonna be with us. But artists have soul because they have connection to the streets. All that is missing is understanding of political theory and understanding of the history of organizing to bring that into the way they're using their platform for social change.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that distinction. One of the comments that popped up in the chat, it's not really a question, but there's a comment about the role of, it says white kids. We can extend that to white people, or we can name white kids as white children. And, you know, part of me is one of the things that I sometimes find peculiar is this obsession with white reception of hip hop, which has been going on now for you know, at least 30 years and probably beyond that. If you look at the moral panic of the late 80s and early 90s and parental advisory labels and all of this under the kind of guise of protecting white children. So I find the obsession with the topic kind of indicative of the value placed on white childhood rather than other kinds of child. However, Knox, this is what I want to ask you about it, and because the kind of community activism that you've done and your willingness to reach across boundaries to immigrant communities, folks in different corners of your city. I'm just wondering if you've seen those moments of hip hop reaching communities that would normally be considered outside the bounds of a traditional hip hop community, and what the potential is for hip hop to continue to cross those boundaries. Where does it become something that's problematic when we say, well, you know, what is hip hop doing to white folks? How do we balance the attention of that question with the attention we spend on other questions, right? About what hip hop does for the communities in which it originated. How do you weigh the kind of focus and the balance, right, between those two kinds of questions, right? Where does whiteness enter into this conversation for you and your work?
It sounds kind of confusing because I don't know, like whiteness is harmful in a lot of ways. So I don't know. That kind of was confusing. How does whiteness kind of space? I think when you're talking about any entering any community or hood, you figure out ways to enter respectfully. You know, like what is the norms or codes, or how do you pick up shovels and things. And I think that is that's a part of a lot of ways in communities. I know we pass tobacco to each other for Native peoples and communities. We honor certain sets of like traditional ancestral technologies we do, but I feel like working with communities or any community, I feel like hip hop or non hip hop, I feel like, you know, when we speak hip hop, we're talking about the culture of the ghetto or the hood. You know what I mean? So, like, working with areas, you have to look at how settler colonialism forms like these hardcore racial segregation zones and things like that. You know, so like when you're looking at using hip hop as an organizing tool, like a lot of it is health and harm reduction in the hood from this standpoint, right? So it's just like a lot of these people and kids and elders, they already know what time it is. You know, it's just kind of more language for it, and hip hop can be an avenue for that. You know, especially I'm just saying I used to throw ciphers in the park every Sunday, and it's basically a community organizing meeting with a hip hop concert going on with that. You know, so that looking at ways that's like that's like one way, that's kind of can be universal. Play music somewhere, but it's how you gather and organize people with the intention of that, And I think we need to draw the distinction between activism and organizing. Organizing is like a collective function and goal to get to. Activism is like individual frameworks and good deeds, which is amazing. But yeah, I think that's what you're kind of mentioning. This hip hop crossing boundaries, and it's like it's a lifestyle of making something out of nothing, creating beauty out of disaster, resilience, healing. It's a lot of these new things that are forming to, and all, you know, the peace, love, and unity aspect of it too. Um, so it's been a powerful tool this way in Detroit, you know, organizing people just to gather so we can display information about, you know, the city takeover or just different forms of oppression, and also feel good, right? Because when you just get shitted on with all this left and right, you know, you need some forms of process and go through that, and a lot of that dancing and rapping help with that, and it continues to do that, you know. There's a string, you know, the saga continues, so there's more little homies out there that I taught them when they was, you know, young, and I'm getting older, and then they're carrying the torch, and you know, it doesn't stop. And yeah, it's dope. I don't know. You know, I think it's gonna spread in all types of ways, and it is, and it's beautiful. You know, from all the way in curriculums and academia to curriculums and after school programs, to just, you know what I'm saying, like small tools in history of what this form is. You know, because a lot of youngins see it's like, oh, I can get some money off this and go. You know, it's like it's a route. So
I think that's a great place to end. It points us toward the future, and it points us to the folks who are going to come after us and carry this tradition forward. So what I'm going to recommend we do now is give some kind of silent Zoom applause, and this is our chance to give Samir and Asia a little bit of time to get their instrumentation in order. And I'm going to let them bring us home, because goodness knows it's better to close with music than with anything I could say. So with appreciation for all the contributions of our panelists and our organizers, I'm going to hand it off to Asia and Samir to bring us home. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Dearly beloved, we gathered here today to lay to rest all the mess standing in our way, to bury all the ghosts, all the skeletons and demons, all the weaknesses that keep us from receiving better things. Set an intention to give more, need less, make a way for the blessing, more freedom, less stress. Stop thinking about everyone else and underestimating yourself.
Come on.
Take all of your doubt, all your guilt and depression, all you looking for validation in people and possessions. Take all of your hurt and all of your fear and bury all of that right here.
Talk to him now.
Dust and bones.
Dust and bones.
I've been holding on to you for way too long. I'm giving up the ghost and moving on. Dust and bones.
Dust and bones.
Dust and bones.
Dust and bones.
I've been holding on to you for way too long. Giving up the ghost and
moving on.
Dust and bones. Dust and bones.
Quit stressing, overthinking, overworking. Clear your mind from anything that's toxic. Time to face your fears, never revisit the bitterness, the anger, the grudges you held on to. You gotta leave it all behind. Lock them in a pine box, bury the hatchet, get planted. Solid as a rock, you will grow like a tree. When you let it all go and feel free. Get excited about your future. Keep on digging deeper to reach your highest potential. Become monumental. It was I against I, now I'm truly satisfied.
I against I,
truly satisfied. Said
dust and bones.
Dust and bones.
I've been holding on to you for
way too long.
I'm giving up the ghost and
moving on.
Dust and bones.
Dust and bones.
Oh, what a feeling. Now that I can see that I got love for something, yeah, but it ain't got love for me.
Nah, nah, nah.
Oh, what a feeling. Now that I can see that I got love for something, yeah,
but it ain't got love for
me.
Nah, nah, nah.
Trying to find more reasons to smile than to cry, cause these eyes have known rivers bigger than the space between the saints and the sinners in a world that doesn't really seem to pray anymore. What can I say anymore when the war's raging in us and the wars waged against us are about the same size, and these times are so different, so vicious, so crucial, so dark and so bright at the very same time. I urge you to carry any goodness you can find. I know it feels heavy, but you'll bear the weight in time with the ease of baby smiles. For your spirit get grown, your energy explode, for your feet on unpaved roads. Put a flower in a gun, tell them buck a shot for peace. As our warriors increase just to protect us from police. There's flames in our bellies cause there's fire in the streets. Cause all you ever feed us is injustice and defeat. But we don't have to eat and we will not retreat. Devoured all your sour, now we craving for the sweet. We have hands that know violence and hearts that know grief. Our souls screaming violence, begging for release. Police, what if I should take a bullet, point the trigger at your baby, say it's his ways that made me do it, huh? Would you forgive me? I ain't got that hatred in me. That's the sour in your stomach and the bitter in your bones. And that's the fact that you can't stand to see a black man on a throne in the place you call home. And that's the fact that you can't stand to see a black man on a throne in the place you call home.
Let's go.
What a feeling. Now that I can see that I got love for something, yeah, but it ain't got love for me.
Na, na, na.
Oh, what a feeling. Now that I can see that I got love for something, yeah.
But it ain't got love for me. Na, na, na.
Hey, yeah. Hey, Dustin Bone. Hey, yeah. Hey, Dustin Bone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to everybody, the panelists, for the staff, the administration for putting this together, and everyone for attending. Thank y'all so much. Much love from us to you. Thanks, everybody. Rennie and Mariah and Knox, we need to link up.
Word.
I think we got that. I think they sent out that group email like a week ago. I'm gonna hit all y'all up.
Oh, for sure. You already know.
I was playing with y'all in the background with the beat machine.
Oh,
I also definitely looked y'all up on Spotify while you were playing. I was like, I need to put this on my playlist ASAP. Where is it?
I seen Rennie with a little.
Oh yeah, I was about to bust a couple moves out.
Yo, we've been exploring this calling our music roots music, because we don't have to deny or inflate any part of ourselves in order to make or explain, you know what I mean, what it is we make, because all of our roots run so deep. So thank y'all for being the root and the flower and the fruit and all of that. Love and appreciate everything y'all are doing in the community, and love and appreciate everybody for taking the time to participate in something that gives you a better understanding of other people and increases understanding, empathy, and compassion. Big love to y'all for attending and putting something together that connects us in that way. Much love, y'all. I'm gonna go get the baby.